Palm Springs, California, folks, is considered the playground of the rich. But there was a time when black Latinos were forcibly removed from their homes in the heart of Palm Springs in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now they and their descendants are suing for billions. We're joined right now by attorney Areva Martin, who is involved in this case. Areva, for folks who don't understand Section 14, what this area is, so just explain, just set this whole thing up, this particular lawsuit, and what these African Americans and Latinos are actually saying.
Right. So Section 14 is a 1 square mile area in downtown Palm Springs, California. It's finally called Section 14. It actually is a plot of land that was owned by the Agua Caliente indigenous tribe. And as blacks and Latinos were moving into Palm Springs in the 1940s and 1950s, many blacks escaping the South, thought they were escaping Jim Crowism, moving to California, looking to find the American dream, looking to build homes, to build generational wealth, to really provide a bright future for their families. They realized that California wasn't very different in many ways than the South, and there were racially restrictive covenants that prevented blacks from living on streets where whites live. There were banking and financial restrictions that prevented blacks from getting loans for cars and for homes. And the indigenous tribe was the only group of people who were willing to allow African Americans and Latinos to live on their land. So black folks built a community on this plot of land, 646 acres, 1 square mile, finally referred to as Section 14. They built homes, they built churches, they built businesses, they built a thriving community. And this is while they are working to help Palm Springs become this exotic getaway in the desert. They were working as cooks and nannies and maids and chauffeurs and carpenters and builders as Palm Springs was building itself up to cater to the likes of Gene Autry, Frank Sinatra, Lucille Ball, and some of the biggest names in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s. But they had a problem. Despite wanting this free labor, despite wanting these African American and Latino families to provide these services, they did not want these families to be in the heart of downtown Palm Springs. They wanted them, they wanted their labor, but they wanted them out of sight. So the city basically hatched a plan to remove the families from this community. And they didn't use eminent domain. They didn't use a legal process. They used sheer might, sheer force. They demolished using bulldozers, the homes, and then they used the city's fire department to set the homes on fire. So they upended this very vibrant black and brown community, and they buried the secret essentially for 60 years. And now these families have found their voices, and they're speaking out, and they're demanding not only an apology, which was issued, but they're demanding that they receive some kind of reparative justice.
Wow. But I mean, we think about we just had the 102nd anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre, and we talk about that. I never heard of this.
Yeah, Roland, so many folks say they didn't even know black folks lived in Palm Springs. A lot of folks have traveled there. They've played at the golf courses. They've played at the tennis courses. They've been to the nightclubs, the swanky restaurants, the swanky resorts. And you literally can drive through Palm Springs and you'll be driving through what was Section 14. But there's not a plaque. There's not a monument. There's nothing that evidences the tremendous contributions of black and brown folks in the building up and the development of the city. And unfortunately, a lot of the city leaders want it to be that way. They wanted Palm Springs to be this homogeneous, white, wealthy getaway. And they were able to accomplish that to a certain degree. But obviously, like I said, these families have found their voices. They're speaking out. They're telling this story to anyone who will listen. We're telling it, in the national media, to the national press. And we're demanding that the city recognize the contributions of these brave and courageous individuals, and that they do something to address the racial trauma that these survivors experienced.
This is a statement from the city attorney of Palm Springs, Jeff Bellinger. He said the city council has issued a formal apology and has set the city on a course to attempt to make amends for what happened back in the 1950s and 1960s. I have been in communication with Ms. Martin, and it is my hope that with her assistance, we can continue focusing the city's resources on that course of action rather than on unnecessary litigation. Here's the thing, Areva, why I think this is so important here. When we're having this conversation about reparations, and folks are invoking slavery, critics say, well, wait a minute, you weren't directly impacted, and so how can we now trace this back? What I have long said is that if we're talking about how to seek justice, there are black people living today, and in this case, black and Latinos, who were alive then, who were forced out, who were economically impacted. Their children were economically impacted. So you have a situation here where you can tie individuals directly to being forced out, and how if they had stayed there and lived there as Palm Springs became this rich enclave, multi-million dollar homes. I need people to understand. I was just playing in Anthony Anderson's golf tournament at Bighorn in Palm Desert. There are homes there around Bighorn that range from $5 to $45, $50 million and up. And so we're talking about multiple millions of dollars that black and Latinos could have been able to sell that land for had they not been forced out.
Yeah, you're right on the money, Roland. We're talking about the loss of generational wealth, intergenerational wealth. And we know that the black-white wealth gap is as wide as it is today is because white folks have had an opportunity to own their homes, to build equity in their homes, and then to pass that equity down to their children. Their children have been able to draw that equity down, use it to start businesses, to make investments in the stock market, and to basically get rich and to help their future generations get rich as well. We've been denied that opportunity. And you are right. We don't have to reach back to the 1800s. We don't have to talk about slaves that none of us knew. I have living, breathing clients. The oldest are in their 90s, but many of these clients of mine are in their 70s. They're in their 80s. They have vivid memories of what happened. They have the scars from this racial terrorism, racial terrorist attack. So unlike some of the reparations actions that are happening around the country, and I applaud those actions because I'm so encouraged by what we're seeing, even in places like my hometown, St. Louis, that is even considering studying the history of racial discrimination and racial attacks in Missouri. This is a case that is, I think, a poster child for how white folks, in particular, those that count themselves amongst the liberal, can make good on a promise. As you see, that city attorney's statement says he wants to work with us. So we want to hold him to that statement. We want to work with him too, but we want to work beyond just an apology. And we know in this country, unfortunately, we can never, ever come up with a dollar amount that would repay folks for the kind of racial trauma that they have experienced. But we have an imperfect civil system, and that imperfect civil system relies on money judgments, money verdicts as a way to send a message and as a way to deter future conduct. So we're hoping that the city makes good on that statement that you just read from its city attorney.
I am not, and I just want to be very clear here. I am not dismissing nor negating or minimizing the city's apology, but I don't give a damn about apology. Here's why. I'm using Tulsa as an example. It took all these years for them to finally come to an apology. But when it came time to the money, nope, state didn't want to do it. City didn't want to do it. They built this museum there, trying to attract tourists there. Did not want to share the resources with the black folks there as well. And so this is where I don't want to hear I'm sorry. I want to see, as we always say, we have a segment on our show called Where's Our Money? Because when we're talking about, and I need the people who are watching and listening to understand how I'm framing this. If those black folks were able to sit here and own that land, and then it begins to get developed, and then sell it. Now all of a sudden, that changes paying for a college. That now changes being able to buy homes for their children and helping with the down payment. That now changes paying for weddings. That pays for all kinds of different stuff. Now all of a sudden, you now have, since 1950s, 1960s, two and a half generations who are not further in debt. And so that's the thing that the people really need to understand when we talk about There are living, breathing individuals right now who were victims of white domestic terrorism, and they have never been properly compensated, and their families could have been changed economically. Their children's children if the city did right. And so that's why I hear the city attorney, but Palm Springs, they gonna have to pony up.
No, absolutely right, Roland. You know, when we start talking about compensating Black folks for racial terrorism, we often hear folks say, well, it's not just about a check. Well, you know, when it comes to Black folks, folks are quick to say it shouldn't be about a check or it's not about a check. But in reality, it is about a check. When we talk about any other community that has been harmed, we don't have any problems with talking about checks and talking about checks in large sums. So likewise, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's 9/11 victims, whether it's the Japanese Americans who were interned in internment camps, you know, we have a history in this country of making folks whole that have experienced some kind of trauma. So likewise, in Palm Springs, what we have said to the city attorney, what we said to the city manager and to the city council is we want a plethora of remedies to address this harm. And one of those, the myriad of things that we're asking for, is a check, because families were burned out of their homes. They did lose their personal belongings. They lost the opportunity to acquire equity, for equity to be built up over time, for equity to be able to be transferred for those things that you identify: college tuition, down payments on loans for businesses, investments in the stock market, et cetera. Those were opportunities that these families, but for the actions of the city, would have had an opportunity to avail themselves of. So it's about a check, and we have to get comfortable as Black folks saying it is about a check, because too many folks, I think, have bought into this notion that when it comes to making Black folks whole for racial atrocities, we have to go to something else, like talk about policies. Policies are important, no doubt about it. Change the housing policies, change the education policies, change the healthcare policies. All of those things are important, but we can also talk about money.
Last question for you. Have you and your team gone to that particular area? And then have you started the process, or even finished, assessing right now what those property values are for that particular area, and then be able to show, okay, this is what it was then, this is what it's value at now, because that sets sort of a framework, or sets the floor, if you will, for conversation and negotiation?
You know, one of your frequent guests, Dr. Julianne Malveaux, is, as you know, world-renowned labor economist. She is on the team, and she has been with us from day one. She's visited the site with us on multiple occasions. She's been in Palm Springs with me on multiple occasions, and she has done an economic harms assessment. It's shocking to me. When I got involved in this case almost a year ago, no one at the city had even bothered to do any kind of economic assessment about what is the harm. You know, if there's a tornado, if there's a earthquake, any kind of natural disaster, sometimes man-made disasters, that's the first thing a governmental entity does, is goes in and does an economic harms assessment. You know, what were the losses? What is it going to cost us to rebuild this community? So Dr. Julianne Malveaux did that assessment, and she estimated that the losses suffered, the economic losses alone, when you think in terms of present day dollars, exceeds $2 billion. And again, that doesn't take into account some of the non-objective losses, like I said, the racial trauma, the pathology that many of these families have experienced because of having their community completely upended. So we are working with Dr. Malveaux and a team. One of the lawyers you mentioned, the Tulsa, Dr. Eric Miller, professor at Loyola right here in Los Angeles, is also on our team. So we have a team of, folks who've been at this a while. They know the issues, that they know how to make these kinds of assessments. So we're encouraged that we are moving towards a solution that is going to make these families whole.
All right, then. Attorney Areva Martin, we appreciate it. Keep us abreast of this case. Fascinating piece of history, and we appreciate you sharing it with us.
Thanks, Roland. My pleasure.